the CPC wasn't really in his contemplation when that statement was made. I think the Minister has made that remark in good faith and will take it as it is. But another comment Minister made about the police judiciously using the information that is collected by TraceTogether. Can the Minister further explain under what circumstances the police would be calling on that information? Because police investigations would, by nature of our legislation, comprise of a wide spectrum of offences. So the expectation cannot be that this information would be used at first instance whenever a police investigation commences. So I'm also mindful as to whether this question should be put to Minister of Home Affairs or Minister in charge of Smart Nation. So I think some clarification of this would be quite important for members of the public, because everybody wants TraceTogether to succeed in view of the public health considerations. But this particular point has caused consternation, and that also probably explains why Minister has decided to make this clarification. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. I think Mr. Singh will know under Section 20 of the CPC, the police are authorized to recover, seek any information within the possession of a person. There are various provisions. As long as it's not, the seeking of such information is not excluded by some other written law. There are some provisions in some written laws which circumscribe the exercise of police powers. Subject to that, the CPC gives the power to the police, and when such a power is given, police are obviously under a duty as well. To give you an example, let's say there is a murder, and victim's family, and information is available on the TraceTogether token. If police chose not to seek that information, you can imagine how the victim's family, and indeed the rest of Singapore, might react to that situation. You could even argue that there can be a judicial review application in such a situation. However, given that this TraceTogether token is necessary for dealing with the pandemic, and it's of national importance, and its purposes are to help us deal with the pandemic, the police approach has been and will be that it's pretty much restricted to very serious offenses. While that requirement is not in the legislation, it will be carefully considered within the police, and discretion will be exercised in seeking this information.
Mr. Chris D'Souza. Mr. Chris D'Souza.
I had wanted to ask if there was a protocol for officers to use the data reasonably. I think that's been answered by Minister, and whether the data can be collected for all crimes or just serious crimes, and that has already been answered. My remaining clarification is, will the data be deleted at the end of the investigations if it doesn't yield anything, or at the end of the case?
Can you come again with your question?
The third clarification is, will the data be deleted at the end of the investigations?
If the data is of no particular use, yes, it will be deleted.
Yes.
Otherwise, it will have to be produced in court
And in trial and so on.
and in trial or used for trial purposes, even if not produced in court.
Mr. Jerogam.
Thank you, sir. Two clarifications. Minister Balakrishnan just now said that once the pandemic is passed, the program, the TT program, will be stood down. So my question is, will the data that's collected by TT, including data that's beyond 21 days, will that be stored on a server and will that still be accessible by the police if they invoke the CPC? And secondly, has the government considered the impact that yesterday's clarification would have on the adoption and the usage of the TraceTogether the app as well as the token? Because as I mentioned yesterday, although we might have 78% adoption, the government there's no real way of finding out whether people are actually using the system. Because you may have it downloaded on your phone, but you can switch off your Bluetooth when you enter the building, or you could use what is called a Faraday bag to keep your token. So there are many different ways in which people can prevent themselves from being tracked if they could well be criminals or engaging in criminal activity. So which is more important then? Is it the fight against this pandemic or these exceptional circumstances where the police, with all the other powers on hand, are not able to trace where the person is and track the person down?
I thank Mr. Giam for that very useful set of supplementary questions. Your first point was what happens post-pandemic. We all look forward to that day. Post-pandemic, first let me deal with the data in your phones and in your tokens. As I said, all that data, first of all, is encrypted and is auto-purged after 25 days. So you don't need to wait for the end of the pandemic before your longer-term historical data beyond 25 days is auto-deleted. You might, I'll volunteer an extra supplementary question for you. What about the data on patients and close contacts, which, with the patient's consent or with the close contact's consent, and in fact active participation, you will know if you look at the app, you actually have to receive a PIN from MOH and you actually have to authorize an upload. That data would reside, when you upload it, in a database that the Ministry of Health contact tracers have. And so long, I would imagine that so long as the pandemic is alive and well, and no, I shouldn't say well, alive and posing a clear and present threat, MOH will want to have that data available because it may be the start of a larger transmission chain. But I believe that once the pandemic has passed, that data, certainly the specific personalized data, those fields should be eliminated. For research purposes, I believe MOH may want to still have epidemiologic data, but it should be anonymized, it should not be personalized, it should not be individualized. So this is a very important point that you have raised, and I think you should continue to ask this point as the pandemic and our response to it evolves. Your second question is a very important point as well, which is what impact does all this open discussion have on participation and on the way we handle the pandemic itself? The member will recall, in fact, I believe he had been, I know you paid attention to this issue even before coming into Parliament this time. There were people who said, well, you've got a tool, make it compulsory. Just enforce it. This is a clear and present emergency. And members will recall that on numerous occasions in this House and outside this House, I have asked that to the maximum extent, I'm going to try to make this voluntary, a much harder target, an approach which requires constant explanation, and sometimes I will get it wrong. And when I get it wrong, I will just come clean and say so. Persuasion. And you should be asking me, why do you take such a, laborious approach? And that's because I believe that our victory over this pandemic is not by us sitting up here and issuing rules and edicts, but that our people must understand not only the measures that we're implementing, but why we're implementing it, the spirit behind it, so that with their understanding and voluntary and full cooperation, we can achieve success. And the reason we are now in this happy situation, and I tell you in stark contrast to virtually anywhere else in the world, is not just because we got two wonderful co-chairmen, Minister Gan and Minister Lawrence Wong. It's not because we've got such technological wizardry, but it's trust, it's understanding, it's cooperation, and it's collective responsibility. So the purpose of the question, the answer to the question yesterday when MOS Desmond Tan answered it, is that we want to be completely above board and transparent. And the reason I asked Speaker's permission to make this clarification is precisely because of this. If there's disquiet, if there's uncertainty, we must answer it. And I must answer it openly, transparently. Mr. Giam, I might be right, I might be wrong. You might agree with me or you might disagree with me. But regardless, at all times, in this house and outside, we must be forthright, honest, open, transparent, and do the best that we can. And it is in that spirit, therefore, that we have these open discussions, and why I remain confident that the participation rate in contact tracing, using the latest tools that we have available, will remain high, and why I hope we will continue to be one of the bright spots in the world. For this is a new year, but I can tell you at a worldwide level, this is not going to be the year that COVID leaves its impact on the world. So let's wait and see, but I'm appeal to you, by all means, continue to push us, ask us, question us, disagree with us. This is the attitude by which we will make progress and overcome. Your final point was on the pandemic. You tried to juxtapose, right, between what we need to do in the immediate short term as an emergency response to the pandemic and the longer term interests of how the police need to be able to safeguard public security and safety. And again, I'm not the Minister of Home Affairs, but let me give you some insight from looking at the situation across the world. In different jurisdictions, the thermostat for how much investigative power you give the police versus the individual's right to privacy is different. If you go to the United States, for instance, you will recall the case where a terrorist, and I think it was a San Bernardino, and his phone was locked. The terrorist was obviously dead, but the FBI needed access to that data and couldn't legally get access to the data. That's their system, and they're entitled to make their own regime and their own thermostat. But what happened at the end of that? We know now that in fact, they paid millions of dollars to get a hacking firm to hack that phone in order to gain access to the contents. Now, I'm not making this as a criticism or as offering it as a model for us, but I'm just making the point that every society has to get that balance right. In Singapore, I submit to you that we have a police force that is not only excellent in its investigative methods, but a police force that enjoys the trust and the cooperation of all of us. And it is this relationship, this trust, that enables us at any point in time, regardless of the crisis confronting us, to set the balance right and to be effective. So I'll tell you very frankly, after I realized that the CPC applied to this, I did have sleepless nights wondering, should I try to persuade my colleagues to change the law? But having thought about it, discussed, consulted people both within and outside this house, I've come to the conclusion that right now we are doing well. We're able to keep Singapore safe. We're able to keep and deal with the current crisis. And so long as this government is able to maintain our reputation for openness, transparency, reliability, I think we are still on the right track. But if you have specific suggestions on legislative or policy changes, we'll be happy to hear from you and from the leader of the opposition. So thank you again, Mr. Kiam.